And we are back on the 0 Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow. And, we've talked a lot on this program over the past few weeks about Donald Trump's cabinet of billionaires, about the highly wealthy, ultra-high net worth individuals, as they say, that he's been appointing to key government positions. It's certainly an oligarchical look to it, but the oligarchs aren't the only people Donald Trump is drawing on. He's also drawing on high military folks as well, and that in and of itself could be a disturbing trend. Here to talk about that with us now is Stephen Miles. He's the advocacy director for Win Without War, which is a coalition of 40 member organizations that came together originally in opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and have been going ever since. Stephen has been on the show before, and he joins us again now. Stephen, thanks for coming back on the program.
Great to be here with you, Richard.
So, okay, let's talk a little bit about, you guys have been talking about the fact that Trump's militarization of the government, as you put it, is a cause for concern. First of all, what do you mean by Trump's militarization of the government?
Sure. I mean, to start out, as you said in your intro, we are talking about a cabinet whose primary requirements for membership appears to be either being a billionaire or a general, or the possible exception of being married to Mitch McConnell. We are seeing an unprecedented level of retired senior military officers take senior positions in Trump's administration. And we believe that this is cause for concern for a couple different reasons. The two primary reasons are, one, there's a very clear constitutional tradition that's actually a foundational principle of what makes our country the country that it is, that we have a civilian control of the military, and we have a separation between the military and the civilian government. The civilian government is there to be the government, the military is there to protect and defend that government. When you see this type of military officer, retired military officer, recently retired military officers taking positions within that civilian government, you're seeing a blurring of that line. The other issue that's really of concern, though, is that the breadth of oversight of areas that we're seeing under control of senior military officials is growing by the day. With the appointment or the nomination of General Kelly to head the Department of Homeland Security, we're not just seeing generals put in charge of kind of the traditional national security aspects of the federal government, but we'll now have a general in charge of America's immigration policy, largely. A general in charge of millions and billions of dollars in federal domestic policing grants and setting policies that are instrumental to the domestic policing we see. At a time when we're seeing the militarization of our border, at a time when we're seeing the militarization of our domestic policing, and these are deeply troubling trends, this is a further step in that direction. And that's before we even get to a possible general or admiral in charge of the State Department, America's diplomatic corps.
So I hear two things. I think what you've said is very, very important, Stephen. And I hear two basic issues here. One is, and you laid them out very clearly, but just to recap for our audience, one is civilian control of the military that becomes blurred when somebody comes pretty fresh out of the military and then turns around and assumes that civilian oversight responsibility. The other is the militarization of aspects of our governance that are not traditionally military, but that could become, take on a much more military aspect, and in some cases already are in a disturbing way, right? Mm-hmm. So you have two trends there, and one of them, each of them in their independent way is disturbing. And let's talk about the first for a second. Some people may say, well, what the heck? A general knows about military stuff. What's wrong with having a general run the civilian aspect of the military?
One of the important parts of that is that you want a diversity of opinions coming up to the president and helping the president make decisions as commander-in-chief about America's security and America's defense. Military minds, these are amazing men and women who have been trained, in the case of the three generals who have been nominated, over a century of experience in the military between the three of them, but they are trained in the art of the military. They are not trained in the art of domestic policing. They don't have to worry about domestic support for policies, the kinds of things that are important to a democracy. They oftentimes are not as well versed in other areas of American policy and American power. And so you don't get a diversity of opinions coming to the White House. In the case of President Trump, that's extra concerning. You have someone who has no experience in any level of government, and he's now made his two most senior advisors in the White House, in Reince Priebus and Steve Bannon, individuals with no foreign policy, no military experience either. So you have what in effect becomes a very limited viewpoint coming in to three individuals in this case who are not particularly well equipped to push back on things they hear from the military, to question what they're hearing. We saw that kind of lack of questioning during the Bush administration, and I think we all know how devastating and troubling it was. This is that on steroids.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. And you also have the problem of, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So they're going to be, let's solve that the military way. Now, in terms of domestic policy, you mentioned this really, they both disturb me, but this is deeply troubling to me because, first of all, what we also saw in the Bush administration was a lack of respect for diplomacy, having tragic consequences for this country and worldwide. So we could see that on steroids as well. And we could also see, you mentioned policing and the militarization of policing. This is a very disturbing trend where we started to see surplus military equipment being given to police forces around the country, and increasing emphasis on highly militarized SWAT teams and so on. And then the police also, they get this equipment and they start to use it. So if you have, as has been rumored, a general military person chosen for Department of State, that could be devastating for one reason, but the fact that we have a General Kelly in the Department of Homeland Security really suggests that we're going to be looking at internal policing as well as border protection and so on in very, very military ways, right?
Yeah, definitely. General Kelly's previous job was commander of Southern Command, which is the part of the U.S. military that kind of looks at Latin America. And in that role, he oversaw the military aspects of that. He oversaw concerns about the southern border. Reportedly, that's what makes him attractive to Donald Trump. But that's also what should be alarming for us. There are immense complications with our relationship with Latin America, and very few of them are anything that comes close to having a military response. Part of the flow of asylum seekers and others fleeing the violence that we've seen in Central America, that's not an American military response. How we deal with that is not something that the American military is best equipped to deal with. And we need the kind of creative thinking that comes from having experiences besides several decades in the military. I think it's important to say these men have distinguished careers on their own, and by most accounts are strong, successful, capable battlefield commanders. This isn't about their military experience. This is about the experience they bring to the table, the role that they will do in these roles. And I would be remiss if I didn't say in the case of General Flynn, who's been named as the National Security Advisor, there's some deeply, deeply troubling concerns about his particular views and opinions that should cause alarm for lots of us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it should go without saying, but I will say, this is not about a wholesale trashing of the military either. It's about looking at the military in the context of what's supposed to be a civil society and the military's role there. And I would also say, Stephen Miles, that General Flynn is an extreme example, but I think it's also worth mentioning that we're not, in Trump's picks, we're not just talking about any military people here. I mean, we're not talking about General Wes Clark or Dwight D. Eisenhower or some of the other generals who in some ways have had relatively liberal ideas in certain areas. By and large, these are generals or military folks with tough guy reputations, right?
Yeah, they are, and they're certainly, first and foremost, they're warriors. And they've all cut their chops through long careers, but most recently in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, as folks like Andy Basovich have pointed out, I do think we have some questioning to do of our general officer corps about the realities of where we are in modern warfare, the consequences of the decisions made in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how we deal with things like when we were an occupying force in Iraq, how were we doing in terms of the military's role in domestic policing? There's no question that these men in particular oversaw some exceptionally fine counterterrorism operations. They were really good at kicking in doors and gathering intelligence. In the case of General Flynn, though, what we saw when he transferred to be the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, that experience didn't transfer, and it was deeply problematic. And some of his worldviews came back to bite him and cause real problems.
Well, and we've also had the history, and I want to be sure I'm correct here, but you'll know if I don't. We've also had the history of people coming out, in the Obama administration as well, coming out of the military into civilian roles, and I think perhaps not being as responsive to congressional oversight as they might have been. Am I on the right track there?
Well, I think there's been some concern about that. I think one of the bigger concerns for me, is that we've seen, in particular when you think back to the Bush years, when you don't have a healthy pushback of individuals from the president, when the president's giving some pretty outrageous orders, that can be very problematic. And the military is a command and control structure, and certainly there's opportunities for feedback, but it is at the end of the day something where you follow the order that's given, unless, and of course, it is an illegal order. Now, we don't know what kind of orders Donald Trump's going to give. You know, there's been some positive things that have recently come out. General Mattis seems to have been able to convince him that torture is a stupid, horrible idea and something that doesn't work. But that's not to say that when he starts talking about some of his more extreme worldviews and some of his bizarre theories about how we engage with Russia and potentially the conflicts of interest that we're seeing come up in places like Taiwan and elsewhere already, we don't know that we'll have the healthy level of pushback that we would expect from civilians in these positions. And we need to make sure that we're having that, because we can expect, I think, some really troubling ideas to come out of Donald Trump's White House.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty safe bet. And you know, the other military name that's being thrown around a lot now is David Petraeus as a potential Secretary of State. Are you hearing anything more about that, about Petraeus as a candidate?
Yeah, it's a little unclear where he's falling. The latest today, we're hearing from Kellyanne Conway, who's obviously a senior advisor to Trump, is the list of Secretary of State candidates seems to be growing by the minute. But David Petraeus has been long talked about in that position, as has Admiral Stavridis, another former military official. David Petraeus is an interesting one. I mean, many folks have made this point, but it bears repeating that this is an individual who was convicted for sharing classified intelligence and not being careful with America's secrets. He shared them with his biographer, whom he was having an affair with. This is a potential appointment of an individual to an administration that just made its bones being very upset about emails and the potential leaking of classified information. There's no potential here. David Petraeus actively, knowingly, purposefully shared classified information, breached protocol, went to great lengths to cover up things that was a crime that other individuals under his command were being fired for. So there's some real questions about there. And obviously we have deep concerns, as we've already talked about the militarization of America's diplomacy.
Yeah, it's astonishing, first of all, that he's even a candidate for both reasons, both the charges that he was convicted of and the idea that yet another general would be put in charge of it. So is there anything people can do, or is the public essentially at this point a helpless observer when it comes to the militarization of the Trump government?
Well, certainly. I think there's always something people can do. That's the kind of founding principle of our administration. Obviously, under the rules that the Senate Democrats changed previously, there will not need to be a filibuster on any of these nominations except for General Mattis. General Mattis will be subject to 60 votes in the Senate. But whether or not these individuals are ultimately confirmed, and in the case of General Flynn, he's not even subject to Senate confirmation. Mm-hmm. Americans have a role to stand up and demand these men do not just proceed as military officers in these positions. They have a duty and a responsibility to stand up and call out the militarization that we're seeing. I mean, we're halfway to a junta here. If we're not calling that out, we risk the normalization of this and seeing it go even further down the road. So whether or not these individuals get confirmed, whether or not they stay in these jobs for particular long, I think it is beholden on us as Americans who believe in these constitutional principles like civilian control of the military like not having the US military be active domestically. We have to stand up and declare loudly that this is not normal. And whether or not we win that fight in the short term, it's beholden on us to have that fight for the long term. We have to get in the Trump's America. We're probably going to lose a number of fights in the short term. That doesn't mean you don't stand up and fight. And that doesn't mean that ultimately we're not building power and getting ready for a return of progressive power in the future. So absolutely, we think people should get involved. Obviously, they can get involved with organizations like ours and others. But the most important thing is to not sit back, but to stand up and demand our voices be heard.
Well said. And to learn more about your organization, they would go to winwithoutwar.org. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. And obviously, we'd love folks to find out more information about us, but there's a host of organizations, the signs behind me from organizations in our coalition, but whatever organizations people are involved in or groups that they're forming now, people are involved in Facebook, their social media streams. There's never been more ways to be involved, and there's no excuse for not being involved now. So however people want to get involved, now is the time to do it.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director of Win Without War. Thanks for tracking this issue, and thanks for coming on the program and talking about it.
Talk to you again soon, Richard.
You bet. And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.